Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. Stanisław Barańczak is the subject of today's episode. Born in Poznań in 1941, a great poet, translator, and critic who perhaps gave more time to other poets than he did to getting his own poetry out there in English translation, and therefore isn't nearly as well known as he deserves to be in the English-speaking world. He was a founder of KOR, K-O-R, the Committee in Defense of Labor, and the underground journal Zapis that we've mentioned before on this program, referring to the number of the government regulation that would replace text that was censored in a periodical or book. He went to the U.S. to teach at Harvard in 1981 on a 3-year contract, and after getting stuck there during the declaration of martial law in Poland, he eventually became the Józefowski Professor of Polish until his retirement in 1999 due to the effects of Parkinson's disease. And he continued to write and translate until his passing in 2014. As background to this episode, I highly recommend that you go back and watch Season 4, Episode 7 on Nowa Fala, or the new wave in Polish poetry in the 1970s and 80s, with Professor Katarzyna Zechenter from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London, where we discuss some of Barańczak's essays and his iconic poem, A Delineated Era. Before we meet today's guest, I'd like to remind you to subscribe. If you like our series, click the bell to receive notifications about new episodes, and follow our playlist down in the description below to catch up on past episodes. I'm delighted to welcome back Clare Cavanagh, Francis Hooper Professor of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Slavic Literatures and Comparative Literary Studies at Northwestern University. Her book, Lyric Poetry and Modern Politics, Russia, Poland, and the West, received the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism for 2010. She received a 2018 American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature and a 2019 Zajks Award from the Polish Writers Union for her many volumes of Polish poetry in translation, including the work of Wisława Szymborska, Adam Zagajewski, and Ryszard Krynicki. Please check the introductory page linked in the description below to learn more about Clare Cavanagh's honors and distinctions, and for a bibliography of Stanisław Barańczak's poetry in English translation, which you'll need because, let me show you, it's scattered in various journals and anthologies like this one that you probably can't get on the, unless you look on the used market. This edition of the Chicago Review. Here I have a galley of Spoiling Cannibals Fun that has several Barańczak poems, but that was eventually published, so you can find that. This one is still in print, Miłosz's Post-War Polish Poetry. Everyone should have this, but it has a few poems by Barańczak in there. There's this very hard to find anthology called The New Polish Poetry. That's in the bibliography. And also, I think this might be still in print or not too hard to find used, Breathing Underwater and Other Essays by Stanisław Barańczak. So check the bibliography out, and you can find the detailed information and links to where you can purchase these volumes. So Clare, welcome back to Encounters with Polish Literature.
Thank you for inviting me again, and you invite me about all my favorite poets, so I really appreciate it. Plus, as I said before, it's a wonderful series. Great resource for people like me in the business.
Thanks so much. Well, I'm glad you like and glad your students are finding it useful. So let's start. You were Stanisław Barańczak's first graduate student at Harvard, if I'm not mistaken. So what was it like studying with him and working with him as an advisee?
It was actually wonderful. I always regret right now that I can't tell him how much it helps me now when I'm doing independent studies on the history of Polish literature with graduate students that I had this extraordinary experience. I got into Polish by accident. I probably covered this with you informally or formally at some other point. I had to pick a second Slavic language. It was Miłosz, Wałęsa, Solidarity, Papież, and the Pope, and everybody kept saying, one of these days, we're going to have this great Polish scholar, dissident poet, Stanisław Barańczak coming. So I took a gamble and said, what the hell, Polish? And he did come. And I feel like it was the wisest, ignorant decision I've ever made in my life. It was actually life-changing. He was so friendly to everybody and so un-Harvardian. I still remember I went up to him on the steps of Widener Library before we would be introduced. So this huge imposing edifice, and said, hi, my name's Clare Cavanagh. I'm going to be doing Polish with you. And he said, oh, it's so nice to meet you. And he was so friendly and unassuming. And I remember someone in the elevator, I have no idea what it was, saying to him, Jak się masz? And I said, is he supposed to say that to you? Shouldn't he say, Jak się pan ma? And he said, wszystko jedno. You know, he does. So I was.
So for our non-Polish speaking viewers, like the question was, should he be asking how you are in the informal or the formal if he doesn't know you informally?
Exactly.
And he says, whatever.
Yeah, basically. And that was him. So I took a 2-year survey course with him. And he again, as I said, I thank heavens every day I go into an independent study that I did this with him, because he prepared meticulously. He kind of read his notes. It was his first experience teaching in English. And he was just incredibly prepared. And I don't know if I still have the notebooks. I would write down everything. I was fanatical. And then I would take the highlights and put it on note cards and use that to study for my exams. So I don't think I have all that stuff anymore. I wish I did. But he also was just so nice. And I remember saying to him, I don't feel like I'm getting enough poetry. I really want to read more poetry. So I would meet with him one-on-one in his office, and we would just go over poems. And my Polish was just not non-existent, but nothing to speak of, nothing to write home about. I'd had 1 year at Harvard and then 6 weeks in Krakow, and that was it. He should have, if he were a true Harvard professor, he would have shown me clearly I was not up to what I was doing. Instead, I became his research assistant at some point very early on. I remember I became friends with the Barańczaks, or friendly enough to go over to their house, their apartment they lived in, when martial law hit. And it didn't register. I didn't know enough yet to know what they were going through. They'd just been cut off from everything. Their passports were revoked. They couldn't go back. Now I know what they were going through. And now looking through his poems to prepare for this, I see so much in those poems that at the time he would run downstairs when I would come to visit and give me his most recent poem, as if I can sight read Barańczak after 1 year of Polish, but whatever, I did my best. So they were going through so much, but they were so kind and so hospitable and so, as I now realize, so terribly lonely. He was running off his feet all the time from one event to another because of martial law. Speaking, writing, doing all this, but he always just had, and finally I became his research assistant, reading his microscopic writing, which my eyes became noticeably worse while I was working.
You sent me a copy. Is this
that's his
poem?
That's his tiny little bitty writing. And that's it. And man, I was reading that in Polish and in English, and my glasses prescription got so much worse. But he would type up the poems and bring them downstairs. I wasn't in residence after a certain point, and I would come and stay with them, and he'd bring them down at breakfast. Whatever he'd just done, whether it was a limerick or anything, he didn't have his audience. He didn't have his audience, and I was something.
You were it.
And so I was his research assistant. He was asked to translate some poems by Ryszard Krynicki for a little book that came out, Citizen Arcade Does Not Live. It's a little tiny edition. I have it somewhere up there on the shelves.
Right.
So I helped him with his English, and that's kind of how we got started translating.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember he was saying, let's try this. Why don't we keep working? And I said, oh my gosh, I absolutely can't. I don't know Polish poetry well enough. I don't know Polish well enough. I don't. And he said this, we went back and forth English and Polish, and he said in English, why not?
Mm-hmm.
And ever since then, Stanisław's why not? I call him Stanisław in English and Staszek in Polish. I don't know why. I just
Mm-hmm.
I felt so abashed by talking on first name to a professor anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, why not? And ever since then, whenever I just feel like, oh my God, what the? I had one person who said to me, why not? Instead of saying, go out and read 40,000 more books and maybe you'll be ready to write a footnote,
Yeah.
He said, why not? And that was him. That was him.
I remember when I was a graduate student for the first time in Polish. I mean, my undergraduate I did in philosophy, and I became interested in Poland in the 80s. And I went to when I transferred to Cornell, which was normal for people from Deep Springs College, which I attended for my first 2 years. You transfer somewhere, and I was at Cornell. I thought, well, I've done French and German. Why don't I do Polish? It's very interesting. I've read all these interesting books in translation, and why don't I learn the language? And after about same thing as you, I did a year of Polish, 1 year of Polish at Cornell, and then I did a summer in Krakow, and then I was doing a second year in my senior year of at Cornell. I sent him some translation. Maybe I didn't do it right then. Maybe I did when I was already a graduate student. Then I did a master's I went to Poland for a year, and then I did a master's in Slavic at Toronto with Louis Irabarn. Maybe that's when I first wrote to Barańczak, because I was always trying to see him at a conference, but by then his health was already failing, and this was like around 1990, and people would invite him, and he was evidently gracious and always said he would go and would try his best. But if he wasn't having a good day, he wasn't having a good day, so he wouldn't be there. And so then I never got to meet him in person, but I did send him my translations of the Polish expressionist poet Tadeusz Michinski that I was working on at the time.
Choice.
Well, I was working on Vitkacy, and I was interested in the origins of Vitkacy's language. So Michinski was Vitkacy's father's, friend, and he was an inspiration. And there's a story that Michinski was killed by Bolsheviks in Petersburg, if I'm not mistaken, because of a case of mistaken identity. They thought because of his big beard that he was an Orthodox priest, and he was blown up. And this was devastating to Vitkacy. So I said, all right, so I'm interested in Vitkacy. I have to learn Michinski. So I was trying to translate, and he very graciously, Barańczak, sent me his notes and his comments. And then at the end, he said, but really, I think it's untranslatable, which it kind of is. But one day I'll come back to it. And then that's one of the stories that maybe we'll get into later about translation, is that some things seem to come immediately and some things take years, and
for me, taking years is the norm, or letting projects ripen and just looking. I've done a lot of Stanisław's poems. We had plans to do more. But that was quite a while ago, because it was still when he was healthy enough to send me these incredible schematics on how he would send me with multiple colored inks where the triple rhymes were, where this wasn't. I am not Stanisław. I'm not Brodsky. I'm not John Donne. I do not automatically think, let me invent an incredibly difficult stanza and make rhymes out of, whatever. So for me, it just brought back math anxiety. Stanisław, unsurprisingly, was very good at math. He would always want to do the hardest ones first. And I was always saying, let's scale it back. Let's try one where it's just syntactically difficult. That I can handle. Syntax I can do. Wordplay I can. But so we started. But he, as I told you earlier, he also rewrote his poems when he translated them into English. Yeah. He would try and kind of again, the only analogy I can think of is Brodsky. And Stanisław and Brodsky, I think, had a lot in common. I can't really think of anyone else who would be so good in analogy. But I would get terrified because just doing one of those intense, complex, densely rhymed poems, I would work and work and work and then feel like, give me a week in the Bahamas so I can just, but since his health was failing, and I still have a whole bunch, I hope someday I can get a little volume together and not do maybe some of the ones he would have liked to have seen done. But sometimes he was striving for the impossible. And this was like Brodsky too, is when you have people who are extraordinary, just have some part of their brain is there that's not there for the rest of us mortals, where he could do that kind of thing just like, I don't understand it. It's like somebody has like 15 Rubik's cubes in their brain and can say, okay, this stanza, this equivalent, this, and work it out. I don't have that at all. But he was trying to get idiomatic, contemporary American English into the poems somehow. And that's the hardest thing to do. And that would be one of my jobs, is to say, this idiom, totally wrong, gotta go. If you want it, I can tell you one translation story with Szymborska.
Yeah.
Her letter and her poem in praise of her sister who doesn't write poetry. And at one point she says, this is starting to be, oh gosh, I can get the reference wrong, as repetitive as, what's his name, Adam Makadonsky or something. It's a reference that I didn't get, that Stanisław got. But somebody who just does these kind of tongue twisters or repetitive. And his thing, he wanted to do all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, the reference to The Shining. And I said, you absolutely do not put an obscure Kubrick cult reference into a Szymborska poem. Nobody, people are not going to, I said, it has to be something in English that once you start saying it, you can't stop saying it. And so we ended up with Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, because if anybody says Peter Piper picked, you have
they got the rest of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be the kind of thing we would tussle over, is he wanted American so much, but unlike Brodsky, he was willing to ask an American to help him.
But he did it in the other direction. I mean, his like, because he's most famous in Poland, perhaps, for his translations of Shakespeare, his Auden, and all the American and great British poets that he like. I once I was teaching a translation seminar at while they were Columbia students, because they were graduate students, and it was just an independent study, and we were. I gave them Barańczak's translation of, without telling them what it was, of Shakespeare's Sonnet 77, which is the one that starts, thy glass will show thee how thy beauties wear. And asked them to translate it into English. And they didn't recognize it because it's just so fluent in Polish. I mean, it's, in some ways, it sounds better to the modern ear than Shakespeare in a way, because it's absolutely idiomatic. Even though to our ear, the Shakespeare sounds it's archaic.
Well, that's something, that's been said, and I think it's true, that Kochanowski is more accessible to a contemporary Polish reader than Shakespeare is to a contemporary American. And maybe that's true. I don't know. I mean, I've taught Kochanowski in Stanisław's translation with Seamus Heaney, and I mean, it works like a charm, but the Polish speakers are saying, this isn't literal, this isn't literal. And I said, but check the form, the form. This is what they're saying, the forms of poetry. This is Stanisław's whole why would you say the form matters less than the sense, or that the form is entirely distinct from the sense, the literal sense? They're completely intertwined, and you have to figure out how to get as much of each into the mix to give it whatever its quiddity is, to make it essential. I feel like I had this master workshop with a great translator working in the opposite direction. So I had a certain amount of leverage, which was from being completely intimidating. But who really wanted to work with things and play with things. How do we make it work as a poem in English without losing, while retaining, not without losing, but while retaining what makes it a poem in Polish?
And I know also, like, he was translating the Beatles and like contemporary popular song into Polish and trying to make it idiomatic and fit the meter and work.
So you could singable. That's because those were things he also showed me. And I was pedantic because I'm a Beatles maniac. And I would say, you're misattributing the authorship of this particular. But he would create, I remember She Was Just 17, if you know what I mean. And he changed it into a whole little narrative about a very specific girl. And all I remember right now is she had freckles. But to make it singable and work as a little narrative piece, he really wanted to have them be singable versions, except with Beatles copyrights, you can imagine there isn't enough on the planet to. But that was another one of his big things too, was translating operas into singable Polish, since apparently Polish operas are mainly, or opera in Poland is mainly sung in translation, or at least that's what they told me. And trying to make those work as singable. I'm sure for him that was like a vicarious thrill because he loved music so much. But he mumbled horribly and had a little bit of a stutter, and so he was a trumpet player as a young guy. And
I didn't know that about him.
So it was a way to bring musicality and music into his own, to a sphere where he could operate. Right.
Let's take that as an opportunity to look at the first of these translations you've sent me, that Mozart aria.
I have tons of translations in various stages from decades, and I just kind of pulled out some that struck me, and also that I could figure out where my files were.
Well, this one strikes me as a good example of, like, the difference between, the sense and the form. I mean, because here you've got these internal rhymes going on, and you've got, this kind of, and it doesn't always line up, with the meaning. It often doesn't. This one especially, but there's so much going on with these rhymes, and it's like, I look at this translation as kind of one of those warnings to critics, to American and English critics who are writing about translation, and they have issues sometimes with the sound of the translation, or they've read one translation that sounds better to them, and then they read another one that maybe doesn't sound quite as good, but is actually closer to the original in some way that they don't recognize because they don't know what the Polish sounds like.
Right.
And this is to realize, I think, what's in this translation that's working so well. I think you have to have a sense of what it sounds like.
You do. And I just looked over the Polish original myself. I read this at Stanisław's funeral.
Wow.
Yeah. You have to have a sense of what it sounds like in Polish, but also he took liberties, as I said, that I would not have allowed myself to take. He's recreating his own poem for a new language. Yeah. And he made decisions that were very... when I was just looking over it, I can look up the Polish if we need it, that non so...
I have it in front of me.
which is from Mozart, obviously.
Yeah.
So his translations of Mozart's arias are in here. That lucid lion's den, that frail fortress's flight, that friendly fire, that anapestic pulsing from floor 10. The images are not the same.
No.
What he obviously wanted to work with me on, and at this point, I no longer remember who did what, because we just go back and forth and back and forth. We kind of had a great relationship in that way, because we started out being really super polite anytime we had a criticism. Then we just kind of said, oh, forget it. Nah, this is not going to work. Try again, or take that one back to, So here you obviously wanted, above all, and I could look it up in the Polish here, the alliteration to come through.
Yeah.
And my job was to help him get where he wanted to be in terms of alliteration. But what he's doing here, and this is something else I know about, because I would be reading, I have all his volumes of translation somewhere, either in here or in my office, that he would send me everything. He'd been translating Elizabeth Bishop's Sestina.
Right.
And that inspired him to try sestinas on his own. And they have very specific stanzaic and rhyme patterns, and a really limited number of rhyme words. So 10, 10, 10, 10. You can do some switches: empires, fire, expire, entire, higher, higher. You have to repeat things in a certain pattern, and that's the point. Without the repetition, it's no longer the poem. Because it sings rising up, and there's one specific thing had to be heard precisely there and then. We don't have the same thing. We have the questions, but kiedy szedłeś wzdłuż bloku, when you were walking aside, and block, of course, it's only a Soviet
Right. So let's read. You want to, maybe what I'll do is I'll read it. Would you like me to read in Polish, and you can read it in English? Z okna, na którym piętrze, ta aria Mozarta. Z okna, na którym piętrze, ta aria Mozarta, kiedy szedłeś wzdłuż bloku, a w tej samej chwili waliły się i z gruzów wstawały mocarstwa. Non so più, ten żar róż bez ciężaru, ten żar na śmierć i życie, pędzący za chmarą motyli, a nepestętna. Właśnie ta aria Mozarta miała tu brzmieć, jak gdyby istniała gdzieś karta praw przechodnia spod bloku, której nie gwałcili ci inni my, ci z gruzów wznoszący mocarstwa. Gwarancja, że choć jedna zasłona nie zdarta do szczytu płyta przetrwa, że zawsze uchyli jakieś okno czy wyrok ta aria Mozarta. Jak gdyby wszystkie dobra zdążyła ta martwa ręka niepoczytalnie zapisać nam, czyli kopczykom gruzów, z których wstawały mocarstwa, w których rosła wbrew nim na niczym nie oparta wiara, że to nie błąd, że nigdy się nie myli w oknie, na którymś piętrze ta aria Mozarta. Waliły się i z gruzów wstawały mocarstwa.
That Mozart aria up there, which floor, 10? Which window, 16th from the left? Empires were tumbling down and rising up again. That non so più, that lucid fire, lion's den, that frail fortress's flight, that friendly fire, that anapestic pulsing from floor 10 had to be heard precisely there and then, claiming its makeshift right not to expire, though empires were rising up again, and our consent had mixed with their cement. One Mozart tape may still salve the entire globe's pain if played in time on some floor 10. As if that long dead hand still tried to lend us all its wealth, us, those cheats and rogues for hire, rubble from whom empires rose again, but who held too a prayer with no amen, who hope this aria will never tire or err, the Mozart aria from floor 10. Empires fell down and rose up again.
In the original, there's nothing about the 10th floor or anything, but there's the sound 10, which appears 10, 10 rouge, bez 10 jaru, 10 jartna, and then anapestentna. Yeah, and it's everywhere. Szczętu, ręka, pięcie, that nasal that's very Polish, that's very hard to do in English because we don't have nasal vowels, is something that you managed to keep because obviously that's something that you both thought was important.
It's funny because the analysis in a way comes in hindsight. At the time, you're just listening as hard as you can. I mean, you're a musician. You kind of know. I've tried to explain this before. I played various instruments back in the day and realized that I had no future in that line of work. But I never said I'm going to read through all of Chopin's waltzes and then I'm going to start practicing. You just take the one you're practicing and do it over and over and listen to another version and do it. And so I think the sound is probably just kind of stuck in your head and you don't say, I need something to reproduce the nasal. You just kind of say, oh, that sounds right. There's something about that. And the thing about getting all of the repetition in here, is the whole poem about the hope. Repetition is both despair and hope in a way. Empires fall and they rise up again. This is I don't have the date in here, and I'm waiting for a great scholarly edition that says where everything first came out. Those little Osolineum editions are. This is the fall of the Soviet Empire on the one hand, but it's not. There are terms that make you look. We changed that to tape. The shifts in musical technology are showing up in here as well. But probably it's just because record would have been too long as a word, and maybe we were listening to these things on tape. I don't know. I don't remember now. We tried to keep a lot of enjambments. They're not the same enjambments.
No.
Make sure that they're enjambments. So you get instability going and repetition at the same time, and that the aria may last. There's something that may last, and that's the aria. And so you have the repetition, and that's another little thing. I was listening to what we were doing here. And again, when you're doing it, you're not saying, oh man, I've got a fricative going here. I got to keep my fricative. You're saying, oh, this is, we got a lot of sounds from aria.
Yeah. Well, and some of it is, the anapestic pulsing is non so più. Da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-dum. That one, that's so that's there. And you can imagine him hearing that. And there's something very, on the one hand, very realist about it. I mean, that listening to somebody practicing on some other floor, there's that, the beginning of this is something I'm dealing with in another translation that I'm working on right now, is like this Polish vagueness, and that you can say in Polish in a poem, z okna na którymś piętrze, the window on some floor or other, and we just,
so you have to lose some words, especially
clunky in English, right? I mean,
and which floor, the way we got indefiniteness in here, and again, which window, we got indefiniteness in here, and then 10 is a question in the beginning, and then it becomes a certainty as it goes along, just because you have to locate it. Some had to be heard precisely there and then. You're trying to establish some sort of continuity from all of them.
You've got the theme of, life is short and art is long. I mean, that's also, that's the Mozart. And even though you're in this Soviet apartment block and, in the waning days of the Soviet Empire, and then it's also like the virtuosity of Mozart, I think, is that you have this counterpoint between the I and the N, I think, in the translation. That
well, there's also, just the aria still. We have options for aria that wouldn't be there in Polish, because aria will never tire you. So you have the R coming back, or air aria. There are things. And this is, I mean, it's not original to Stanisław, but you do creative compensation. I've got
Yeah.
a little bit of this. And again, the analogies people make, but I think they're valid. And they're things that I tried my hand at both of them. So I feel like I have a little bit of experience as I did a lot of acting and a lot of music until I got through high school and went on to other things. Is a performance is about creating compensations. You're not trying to recreate Shakespeare as it was. And if you are, it's already different. It's like, it's like Borges' Don Quixote. If you're doing an original Elizabethan production in 2024, it's no longer an Elizabethan. It's farce or it's whatever.
Yeah.
So you're trying to come up with compensations, and you're not going to, even if you're playing an original instrument, you're not an original person playing an original instrument, knowing it's an original instrument. You're a 21st century musician saying, "Look, I'm playing on whatever."
Well, I've heard historical performance people say, like, even if we try to play, historically informed performance, if we try to play Bach on Bach's instrument and Bach's style, we can't do it without having Beethoven in our ear. That's
exactly. We're doing it in retrospect, and the poem is also about retrospect. This is something. I mean, I love his syntax. He has extraordinary syntax, and that's one of the things translating rhyme and meter can make me, as my French friend says, want to suicide myself. But I love, he has wonderful syntax, and Adam Zagajewski in a different way has just glorious syntax. And that's something I really love. Present and past. The poem is written after the fall of the Soviet Empire. The experience it's recreating.
Do you know what year it was written in?
So this is from 97. And he'd just written this poem. So this gives you an idea, because it's Znovik wierszy. It wasn't yet in a collection. So the empire's fallen, but in the poem, he's remembering back Szedłeś. He's talking to himself and that's why it's hard to place. He remembers one. He remembers there was a Mozart aria, and that he's recollecting it means it's still moving in this circular motion. So the aria did live with him in a particular moment, and recollecting it is what makes it kind of completes the circling back motion.
Yeah.
Now I can think back on that moment. And what do I know thinking back on that moment? Well, the empire is gone now. Is it gone for good? Empires fell down and rose up again. I love it that he said that, because we know.
This one is also one that's in the Chicago Review.
Yeah, we must have done them both around the same time. She cried that night, but not for him to hear. To Anya, the only one. She cried that night, but not for him to hear. In fact, her crying wasn't why he woke. It was some other sound, that much was clear. And this half-waking shame, no trace of tears all day, and still at night she works to choke the sobs. She cries, but not for him to hear. And all those other nights she lay so near, but he had only caught the breeze's joke, the branch that tapped the roof, that much was clear. The outside dark revolved in its own sphere. No wind, no window pane, no creaking oak had said, she's crying not for you to hear. Untouchable are those tangibly dear, so close they're closed, too far and reach and stroke a quaking shoulder blade. This much is clear. And he did not reach out, for shame, for fear of spoiling the tear's tenderness that spoke. Go back to sleep. What woke you isn't here. It was the wind outside, indifferent, clear.
And here you've translated it into iambic pentameter, pretty much all of it, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Not for him to hear. Yep. Yeah.
It's right on. So that must have been, and the original is more, I would say, a kind of a loose pentameter, because it's hard to be iambic in Polish.
Yeah, it's hard to go iambic in Polish, but you have, if it's, I'd have to go through and parse it. Nie był płaczem dla niego, chociaż mógł być o nim. Yeah, it's not. It's got rhythm, but it's much more colloquial I mean, it's much more informal sounding rhythm.
Yeah. And then I was thinking about, the way that you translated the first line. And, literally, it's, she cried, at night, but not to wake him up. And that would have been terrible in English. I mean, not for him to hear is something open, and you end up with like this open sound, and not to wake him up. And then you've got to think of all the things that rhyme with up and hearing up, 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 up over and over again through the end of the poem.
Not to wake him up, just the other thing, then it starts sounding like goofy iambic. It sounds like...
Yeah, this is, I mean, did he have that sense?
Comic opening line. I don't know. It's too long ago. And as I said, even if I had all the drafts, even if the computer I had whenever we translated this still was functioning instead of a gigantic paperweight, I wouldn't want to go back and look and see how long it took to get us there. In a way, for me, the finished product is the finished product. People say, wouldn't you want to put the drafts in an archive somewhere? And I feel, God, no. I don't want to see, I don't want to think about them. And I understand why people do it, but it's just not, I'm glad they're gone. Or, I've moved so many times. You must understand about this.
Yeah.
My paper archives are not enormous in any case. They may be up in Stanisław's archives somewhere, but I haven't got them. So I don't know how we reached our decisions. I mean, I remember some decisions on some Szymborska things. I still think that this is as close to a perfect poem as anybody could possibly ever write. It's an extraordinary poem. And it was Szymborska's favorite. There was a celebration of Stanisław's poetry. I'd have to go back and look it up, but it's obviously before she died. And because she was Szymborska, she got first pick, and this is what she picked at the celebration of Stanisław.
I can imagine, because it is more colloquial in the way that she wrote. It's more personal. It's less obviously virtuosic in the way that the Mozart one is. I mean,
more personal, and it's funny. I read it. I was at an event in. At a translator, I was visiting translator at University of Arkansas, where Jeff Brock, this great translator from Italian, teaches. And I read this at the evening reading, and the two people, Jeff Brock and the other translator who I was talking to, they said, I can't believe, this poem is so personal. I can't believe you even put this. It's so not like him to be this personal. The thing that, I mean, among the many things that makes me sad is I just feel like, man, he could do that, then what would he have been able to do 10 years later if he'd been given a chance? What would he cranked out a lot of comic poetry, but for him, I think that was mainly like his brain needed constant exercising.
Yeah.
Just like if you weren't, I remember going to the beach with him and Anya once, and he wanted to make up clarity.
Yeah, Anya was his wife.
Yeah, Anya was his wife.
And this is dedicated to his wife, Anya, the only wife.
And this poem is another one where he's learned exactly the great Elizabeth Bishop villanelle is this one art, which Stanisław translated. I don't have his translation in front of me here. They're both about knowing things and wanting not to know them and doing everything you can not to know them. That protestation, he protests too much and he has to do it over and over again, the speaker in the poem. He didn't wake up because of her crying. It was another sound. He can interpret her tears, this half-waking shame, and no trace of tears. At right night, she works a choke. He knows exactly what's going on emotionally. He doesn't say what's the cause. He doesn't say any of that. And all the ways that you try and deflect the knowledge that everything in the outside world is telling you exactly what you want to hear. She's crying, but not for you to hear. So he can hear everything else. The trees talking to him, or he's saying, he says they aren't talking to him, but he knows exactly what they would be saying if they actually were talking to him. Mm-hmm. So the message he keeps, and then the tears, he reads the tears. And this is such an Elizabeth Bishop thing to do. Mm-hmm. Personal, but super oblique. You can't figure out what is the source. The source isn't in here. The thing that repeats over and over is the tears. Those other times she represses the tears. And he both knows and doesn't know what the tears are caused from, or doesn't want to know. And so the repetition in here is psychological. It's not historical. It's not going back to a distant past. All those other nights she lay so near, and he had only caught the priest's joke. Yeah, I just think it's an extraordinary poem. I mean, to me, it's right up there with Bishop, and that's about as good as you can get.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we have time for one more. So which would you, because we've been, there's
so much, and
there's so many great ones.
And I was just going back and looking through all of his, I was just getting all, and I think the one we should look at is another one that has all these translation stories attached to it, where he really went off, is Plywood.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at Plywood. Yeah, now like I emailed you to find out, you sent me the Polish and you sent me the translation, and the translation is 3 stanzas longer, and there are things that at first I didn't recognize it, and then I realized, because it was doing different things at the beginning. I mean, the poem is translated as Plywood, but the opening lines are dicto sklejko tekturo płyto paździerowa jeszcze się wyprostują I kość pacierzowa. And the line, the opening stanza that you have is, "Oh, Plywood, second best to the real stuff. Believe me, one day I will say enough." And that's a great opening in English. That's not the opening in Polish, but that's fine.
It's a variation on the poem, and that's another kind of musical technique he's using is theme and variations. Is he treated the English, and again, maybe I have somewhere there's some box that I never unpacked from one of my million moves I made between 1979 and 1999. It's just like moving every other year. It's like. Maybe it's in there in somewhere, but so I don't know, but I know he sent me his version. This is the way it would work. And then we would just go back and forth and back and forth. And this one, he changed it quite radically. And I felt like, okay, your poem, we're going to go through. And it has a lot of the same. It's the same sense in a way as the Polish. It's mortality and change. I'll stand erect. Well, he always walked with a stoop. And so much of his poetry, I mean, this is one thing I was going to mention vis-a-vis the Określona epoka, is the body is such a weird but constant presence in these poems. And because I knew him really, really well, actually, I lived at their house for long periods. He makes us stumble when we're reading his poems because he has that whole poem about ustawienie głosu. How do you get it right? Maybe someday I'll be able to speak straight. He has another poem, what's it called? But he has another one. I wrote down the title because I knew I'd want to remember it, but now I can't find the page where I wrote it down. So much. Oh, yeah. Kwestia rytmu, about not being able to march in step, which, of course, is a political gesture and about mass society. Yeah. But he really, literally would not have been able to march in step. His rhythm didn't fit. And he always had a little bit of a stoop. So this one, my stooping, he has a joke that I got in the Polish because I knew it from Russian, is the coffin will make the hunchback straighten out.
Right.
And that's... Would
you like to read the poem, Plywood?
Sure.
Our audience has it.
I get going, and I was so nice to go through all these things again. I apologize.
I'll
just mention one more thing about that needs attribution in the translation. Is the New Yorker asked me for a poem after he died, Paul Muldoon, the great Irish poet, another virtuoso poet.
Right.
And he and I went through multiple versions to try and get the poem. It took me, Stanisław, and one of the greatest living poets in English to try and get this into, he's hard. And this is an early poem, an earlier poem, 70s, I think. I'd have to look it up. Oh, plywood, second best to the real stuff. Believe me, one day I will say enough to my own stooping. True, I've never stood upright as you do, planks of processed wood, but I'll try. My backbone will unbend, and I'll be standing straight until the end of my makeshift but rectilinear prayer, one stiff-backed as a chest of drawers when we move heavy furniture around. I will rise from the dead, though on what ground, and which I don't know. I'll stand erect, though my vertebrae's hierarchic sect won't outlive plywood. No, it just can't win against that vertical eternity, so thin and yet so sturdy in its ersatz pride. As if the moon had shown me its dark side, I stoop, my ear glued to a cupboard's back, and I can hear its hollow and exact hymn to its own cheap immortality. No weight, I still can straighten, still can be. Square with this upright world, just as I should, upstanding as 4 planks of solid wood. One thing he always objected to was being treated as a primarily political poet.
Mm-hmm.
And the politics are there in the Mozart Aria. The politics are there. He has another poem called, I can't remember right now. It's from his last collection, but it's about the smart missiles being used in the Iraq War, where he's attuned to all of that world all the way through, but he's also, his first great love, first translations into Polish from English were the metaphysical poets. And that's where this one thing he shared with Brodsky.
Mm-hmm.
The contemplation of the material world, the possibility of another world, which runs throughout his poetry. There's a little, it's not metaphysics, it's a yearning for metaphysics. It's hoping that the physical world isn't everything, but never knowing for sure. And here, the physical world is shoddy. That takes us to People's Poland right away, that everything, it's pressed wood. What do we call it? Pressboard in English?
Pressboard, plywood, yeah.
Yeah. It's whatever, whatever you make out of what's left over that's not really wood. And here at the in the part that 4 planks of solid wood, there's a dream of real matter and a real self that can stand up straight.
Mm-hmm.
And rise from the dead in a way you can't quite get the relationship between the material world of second-rateness,
Mm-hmm.
People's Poland, but it's also our regular world, because he writes about it in his last collection too, as a crummy microwave, and the world of things that don't work the way they're supposed to, which is pretty much everything.
Yeah.
And whether we'll outlast our stuff, whether he will be raised upright in a world of real wood, I will rise from the dead, though on what ground? I'm guessing that was his joke, that he made that little wordplay
Mm-hmm.
there. What ground? Which I don't know. It's, in a way, it's kind of the "Not All of Me Will Die" poem. It's the classic recollection sort of poem, but it's very different from the Polish, which has multiple varieties of crappy material built into the title.
Built into the title and repeated over and over again. Yeah.
Yeah. And here, the one thing I remember, I had such a good time working on this poem with Paul Muldoon, because it was like working with Stanisław. Someone who was a formal virtuoso, and you could just really do back and forth with, because you wanted to get it right. That's what Stanisław didn't mind if I fought back. I didn't mind if he fought back. Sometimes we would whine that his pun was better than mine, and I had to get rid of a really good pun or whatever. But you have to get it the best it can be.
Mm-hmm.
He was trying to use different kinds of wood in here. And this is where knowing the person really helps. I said, Stanisław didn't know all those different trees. Nature was Anya's division. She's the one when he talks about the observer of birds, it's the poem that hasn't been translated. And she was the one initiating him and forcing him into that world. He would never have known the difference between, aspen and spruce and pine and stuff he wouldn't have known. Plywood, that's his comfort zone, is weird man-made world, human-made world, not the natural world. So I said, we're not doing any varieties of wood because he would never have known them. Muldoon does.
But in English, we have plywood and pressboard and cardboard and all those things. Yeah,
we have all of those things. But he was trying to introduce some other kind of wood in there. We have all of those things, but he decided, and I'm not going to object. I mean, he's the genius. He decided to rework it, and my job is to make the reworking work. So that was what we tried to do.
And it does work. But so is there a plan for it's so great that you can, that you're here to talk about Barańczak, because, he isn't, terribly well known as a poet himself in English. Is there going to be a volume?
I really hope so. There was going to be the volume, and that he and I couldn't finish together. And part of that was his illness, and part of it because he always wanted to start with the hardest things worst. And I would have like a tiny micro stroke when I would see what there's so many great poems, and there's so many, just looking through them today, you might have thought back in the 90s, oh man, this is so much people's Poland. Today, they're a little bit creepy because we have to think about all these things all over again.
Yeah.
And that's where you see the poems. That's when you can tell a poem's lasting, because it's speaking again in a voice that wouldn't have worked in the 90s maybe, but I hope so. I mean, I have other projects I have to finish that I'm only 10 years behind on, so I have to get other things finished first, but this is something I really want to get back to, and I have a lot more.
I hope that you do, because I think it's something we need, and we can be thankful that you approached him on the steps of Widener Library way back. Otherwise, would we have so much Szymborska, Zagajewski, and so forth? I mean, it worked out.
It worked out. I mean, he actually changed my life. I mean, how many people can you say
in
that
everybody's life, because we have those poems. Even people who didn't know Barańczak, have been changed.
Yeah. I get fan mail for Szymborska and Zagajewski over email from people in like Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
I wish I could, I wish I could tell them, because I wish I could tell Stanisław, they used to light up like Christmas trees when you told them something like that.
Hang on. Please subscribe and click the bell to stay on top of the program. Watch the credits for some recommendations about how you can support aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. The Polish Cultural Institute New York sponsors our program. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature, the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is our executive producer. Natalia Iyudin is my fellow producer and editor. Our opening and closing music is by Radek Przedpełski. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month when we'll be talking about a Nobel Prize-winning writer who lived in and wrote extensively about his Polish homeland in the Yiddish language, Isaac Bashevis Singer. See you then.
To szary dzień, jak zawsze w tej okolicy. Cała sceneria dodaje się chwytlanej fotografią z ilustrowanej gazety. Tak szare, tak płaskie są domy, ludzie i pojazdy.